The first thing we want to do is add a dab of frosting to the cake disc to hold the layer of cake in place. Now we're going to pipe a dam around the edge of the cake, which is simply a thick layer of frosting that goes around the outer edge, and it makes sure that any filling that we put on the inside of the cake stays inside the dam and it doesn't leak out into the frosting that we're going to be spreading on the outside of the cake. For this cake, I'm using some strawberry sauce that I have left over from another project, but you could use anything you'd like. You can use jam, custard, or even just more frosting. Now I'm going to build up the layers of my cake by repeating the same process. I'll add another layer of level cake, pipe the dam around the edge, and add my filling. Now it's time to use that piping bag again. Make sure it's full and start piping with the flat side facing out. Start piping the frosting flat against the side of the cake. You're going to start at the bottom, work your way up, and then you'll ice the top of the cake with this piping tip as well. Use the offset spatula to gently smooth the icing on top of the cake. Drag the icing from the center of the cake towards the outer edges. Continue to use the offset spatula to smooth the frosting on the sides of the cake. Nothing at this point needs to be perfect. All we're doing is creating a light crumb coat of frosting on the cake, and this prevents crumbs getting in our final coat of frosting, which is what will be visible after it's complete. As you drag the spatula, make sure to set aside the excess frosting that will come off every time you scrape the cake. We'll use this excess frosting for our second coat of frosting, as well as the decorations on top of the cake. Once you've completed the crumb coat, put the cake in the freezer for 10 to 30 minutes. This will make the frosting firm and make it a lot easier to add the second layer. At this point, my cake has been in the freezer for about 30 minutes. When I touch it, my finger does not leave an indentation in the icing. This is really important for these types of cakes. When we want to have a nice smooth edge, we need to be able to drag the scraper along the outer edges of the cake without worrying about the frosting pulling up pieces of cake and getting crumbs in the outside layer. If the inner layer in the crumb coat is firm from being in the freezer, we'll be able to get a nice smooth finish on our second layer of frosting. Use the same piping bag and flat tip from the crumb coat and add your second layer of frosting all around the outer edges of the cake and on top. Again, it's okay if everything isn't perfect at this point. Go ahead and start evening out your frosting a bit by using the scraper around the sides and on the top. Add the 8-inch cake disc to the top of the cake. Begin using your scraper to gently scrape frosting in an upward motion so that it fills in the little crevice between the top of the cake and the bottom of the cake disc. You may find that you need to pipe on a little more frosting in those places where you dragged the frosting upward, and that's just fine. Go ahead and use that same large flat tip to add more frosting to the side, and then get your scraper and begin to smooth along the edges. This is why we want to use an 8-inch cake disc on top of our cake, because now we're able to use it as a guide and a template to create a straight line along the outside. Even if the inside of our cake isn't quite even, as long as the frosting fills in the gaps and as long as our cake scraper matches up with the bottom disc and the top disc, and we're holding it as evenly as we can along the sides of the cake, as we turn the cake table, the blade of the scraper will even things out perfectly. As you can see, there are little air bubbles in my frosting, and that's totally normal. If you want, take the time to pipe on a little bit of extra frosting and scrape along the sides to even it out. It's also really important to note that I'm cleaning my blade between each time I scrape the cake. So every time you scrape along the edge, be sure you're wiping off the excess frosting into your bowl and you have a clean blade when you come back to the cake. Once you've reached a level of smoothness that you're happy with, go ahead and stick the cake in the freezer for about 10 more minutes. That's what I would normally do, but for this video, I'm actually just going to go ahead and take the acrylic cake disc off. But just so you know, when you stick it in the freezer, it comes off a little bit easier and you don't risk tearing the cake up top. What I'll be doing is the same thing you would do if you had frozen your cake. You'll just slide a knife gently underneath and rotate the cake stand around, pushing the knife further and further across the surface of the cake as you rotate the cake stand. Eventually, the cake disc should lift off pretty easily with minimal damage to the top of the cake. Use your offset spatula to smooth the top of the cake. It's really important to make sure you clean the blade between each scrape. Drag the frosting from the outside towards the center of the cake and wipe it off with a paper towel every time. I've never been particularly good at getting a perfectly smooth top of my cake, so I usually just put a little swirl on the top with my spatula. The hard part's done. Now we get to decorate the top. Take that 1M tip from the beginning of the video, fit it into another piping bag, and then fill the piping bag the same way that we did before. Use a cup, fold the edges over the outside of the cup, and fill it about halfway with buttercream. Create a border around the top of the cake by piping the buttercream in an upward spiral motion. To create a simple border around the bottom of the cake using sprinkles, simply spoon sprinkles onto the bottom edge and use an offset spatula to gently lift the sprinkles up and onto the cake.